It's great to be here in the Hawkeye State. Okay, so I hope you're all awake. I want to talk with you, at you for, I don't know, I hope 40 minutes, a long time, maybe 50 minutes even. And then we'll do a bunch of questions, I hope. I understand you prepared some already based on the readings from me and others that you looked at. I hope. Okay, so let's get to it. Professor Gordon just did most of the affiliations. COWS is the Center on Wisconsin Strategy. CSI is not the TV show with the fly lab technicians and the cool equipment, but the Center for State Innovation. MIP, an unfortunate acronym, is the Mayor's Innovation Project. SSTI, that's the one thing you didn't mention, is the State Smart Transportation Initiative. We're working with your DOT and some mayors, actually, in Iowa on that. Apollo is, as described. EARN is, as described. The latest project is this thing called the Emerald Cities Collaborative, which is an attempt basically on a metro basis to do the high road stuff that I'll be talking about today. To frame the remarks, the German philosopher, famous German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, had only three questions he kept asking. He said, these are the questions we should always ask. What can we know? What should we do? And what may we hope for? What's the rational hope? My questions, the stuff I want to talk about tonight, is basically what's happened to the country and why. What should people of goodwill be for? And this is, I should emphasize that I am a wild-eyed lefty as far as American politics is concerned, which means I believe in the values of the Gettysburg Address and the Sermon on the Mount. That makes me a crazy person, I guess, in the eyes of Glenn Beck. But by goodwill, I mean people of all sorts of ideological persuasions and party affiliation and so on. I believe that, for example, rock-ribbed Republicans can often be people of goodwill. So there's no partisanship going on here. And then how might we realize that? Basically, what should we as, good-thinking Americans or whatever be for, and what might we do? As you see, I made some slides for you. Like this slide. It's a tough audience. And I do sometimes wonder about PowerPoint, the fact that people just put all their words on the damn slide and then repeat it. They say that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I don't think absolute PowerPoint, it just can't be all good. And an instance of that is the Gettysburg Address, alluded to before. That's the sort of basic prayer of American democracy. Here is the Gettysburg Address in PowerPoint. We cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. We'll no longer remember what we say here. Can never forget what they did here. It's not sort of living rather to be dedicated here. The great tasks they fought here, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of the poetry of the Gettysburg Address, 270 words, it sort of states what the project of the nation is. Sort of gets lost in this sort of presentation, I think. But we're going to use PowerPoint. We're going to use a bunch of PowerPoint here. Yeah, next steps, rebirth of freedom. Right. Okay, fine. Ha. Okay. So what happened and why? Let's start with that. Basically, what I think is what happened was a bunch of rich people took over the country, looted it, and now are demanding that we pay them a lot more to do more of the same. I know that may sound crude. It is sort of crude, but that's, I think, basically what happened. Now, if you want to worry about things in life and politics in America, you can worry about a bunch of international stuff. You can worry either as a threat to your well-being or as a tremendous opportunity for human advance jointly. The fact that the world labor force has doubled in the last 20 years or so, essentially since the late 1980s. India turned from autarky, and China decided to go with a sort of state-based capitalism. Which is not democratic, but is certainly capitalism. And the Soviet Union collapsed. The Berlin Wall did come down, and the Soviet Union collapsed. And that meant that a bunch of people entered the labor force that hadn't been there before. These people are making huge investments in their education. Indeed, relative to where they were, much, much greater in absolute as well as relative terms than we are. And that's something a lot of people are worried about. The President of the United States is very worried about that because he realizes America and the workforce in America needs to, in some way, produce something that the rest of this world wants to buy if we're going to get a reasonable trade balance. Not that increasing our trade balance is the greatest goal for the world, and I wouldn't have you think about the U.S.'s major project as being competitive like a firm. Because if countries behave like firms, then we'd mostly get rid of the citizens as a way of reducing our labor force and increasing the profits. And secondly, because just increasing trade flows, that's something that it's always good to have a trade flow and get some stuff that you sell to other people that you can then get money from and buy other stuff for yourself. It's probably good to self-supply yourself in different ways in the economy to a greater degree than we are doing now. But as you know, as Thibault pointed out in his old debate with North about growth, we can't all export. We can't export outside the world. So we got to get some sort of balances in trade. But as we get those balances, you might want to worry about this or think about this. The fact that the world that you're going to be entering is quite different than the world that I entered when I was roughly your age. You might ask, when was that? A century or two ago. It wasn't that long ago, but it was sort of the early 1970s. It was quite different than this period. In that period, the U.S. Trade balance had already turned negative, but you didn't have anything like this flow of people. And when you suddenly double the number of people in the world who are in the world labor force and don't increase the amount of capital, what that does is it makes capital relative to labor the scarcer factor, which means that there's going to sort of be a long-term downward pressure on the relative cost of labor. Or if you don't want to worry about living standards and how they're threatened in one way or another by, try to stay on this by possibly, slideshow is sort of out of control. You could worry about the end of the world if you wanted to. That'd be another thing. Easiest way to do that is to think about the growth in carbon emissions in the U.S. The basic facts here are probably familiar to all of you. In any case, pretty disturbing, I think, to many, with good reason, is that basically from 8 million years ago to 1780, roughly the founding of this republic, and certainly major industrialization, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere was slight, relatively slight, and certainly very stable, amazingly stable over a very long period of time, plus or minus 10 to 280 parts per million. And that increased then about 35 parts per million over the next 35 years, taking you into the 1930s, not too much, and that has run up tremendously in this century. 15, well, you can read as well as I, 15 parts per million over the next 40 years, then 20 parts over the next 20, and then 20 over the next 10, and it's now around 387 parts per million. And at present rates of growth, everyone thinks it should reach at least 500 parts per million by mid-century, so well within your lifetime. And the problem with that is the last time that we reached that level of carbon in the atmosphere, which you can think of as a greenhouse if you want, but I like to think of it as a big old army blanket sort of wrapped around the Earth in which it's just getting hotter. And it holds a lot of water, and it does a lot of other weird things. The last time that happened was the Eocene period, which is about 50 to 60 million years ago, when sea levels were about 300 feet higher than they are today. That sort of poses a problem for humanity that a lot of people are worried about. You could worry about that. But I'm not going to talk about, and here's my version of Al Gore if you want to see the carbon stuff. Boom, that's sort of death up there. BAU is business as usual. And that is where we're heading by the end of the century. And the problem with this, we could talk about this if you want, is that the latest thinking, the best thinking, is that no matter what we do, even if we stopped right away, you'd still have the sort of the effects of climate change that we've already produced. So even if you mobilize, even if we all stopped driving any cars tomorrow and didn't produce any electricity and didn't burn any coal and just zero emissions, the world has basically in the last 15 years or so tipped. It's changed more or less permanently, and you're going to have to live in that world, and that's going to be a world with going to be wetter and warmer and windier and wilder and more destructive of everyday investments than the world that I grew up in. And you might worry about that properly. You might also talk to your parents or people like me saying, what were you doing when you saw this coming right at us? Why did you keep driving those SUVs? Why didn't you try to do something with the third world to get them not to do to their environment what we've done to ours? And why didn't you do anything after Rio? That was, 30 years ago. You just haven't done this deal. What were you thinking? You might say that at Thanksgiving or whenever you go home. Anyway. Or Or you can think about just inequality in general. You know, a crude way to think about this is that 2.6 billion people in the world. The world's about 6.8 billion people. Don't even have a place to take a crap. Just sort of an astonishing thing. Almost 40% of the population. I'm not talking about a nice place, you know, a flush toilet with enamel all over and, you know, French tiles or whatever. But I mean, a bucket. That's a pretty amazing level of inequality. And that's associated with a huge amount of disease and ridiculous stuff. Okay. But I'm going to think about just stuff in the U.S. for the time being because I want to understand what's happening in this country. Those are problems that all countries face. But our response to those problems and many other problems are rather distinctive. What's happened in this country basically is a couple of things. One is a basic social deal that was done and held, with reasonable success in this country, broke apart in the early 1970s. And the deal was one in which, and it's a basic deal in capitalist democracy. I think I refer to it in some of the writings that you did. And it's sort of the basis of social peace. And here's the deal. It's between capital, broadly, you know, the people who own things and control investment in the society, and then workers. And by this I don't mean anything fancy, okay? I don't mean the industrial proletariat, whatever that means. I just mean people who work for a living and do it under the supervision usually of somebody else and need to work for a living, who don't come into this world with a bunch of money such that they don't need to work. They have to work for a living, and they usually work for somebody else. I'll call that the working class. And everybody else who has the money and manages those people and has a bunch of the control over the investment, of social investment, where it goes in the future, I'll call those people capitalists, okay? And capitalists and labor have a certain basic understanding under capitalist democracy, which is this. Labor has to agree not to make confiscatory wage demands on capital. It can't take away all the profits. It can't kill the golden goose. Because unless there's availability of profit and the expectation of profit, there won't be any investment and the whole place crashes. And what capital agrees to do, if you want social peace, is to invest a sufficient share of current profits to provide for future well-being and to share, in some sense, the productivity gains and wealth that's created through that with the workers. And as that wealth grows through productivity, which is the basic driver of wealth, productivity, all the different factors of production, the land, the labor, the capital itself, the technology, etc., then that's shared with workers to some degree. That's what I think of as the basic social accord in capital. And that held in the U.S. That doesn't mean it's certainly not a case of perfect equality, whatever that means. It's certainly not a case of, everybody in the union, but it means that you have a sharing in productivity gains, which allow you to get a very broad number of people sharing in the benefits of the society. It takes a basic measure of economic performance in a democratic society to be how are the fruits of prosperity widely shared, assuming that you produce some in the first place. And those were, with lots and lots of exclusions that I'm sure you've talked about in the class, and we'll talk about even more, all sorts of exclusions and violence and whatever. Those things, that deal basically held in American society for a very, very long time. Until basically the early 1970s, when, as you see, labor productivity continued to climb, albeit not quite at the pace that it had in the immediate post-war period, but labor compensation went in a different direction. And that labor compensation was complicated by the fact that there were things that labor had to take on as costs that it previously didn't have to take on. One way to characterize this is that you had the end of shared prosperity in the U.S. This is a map that takes the share of the total income going to the top 10% of American families over the last, basically 100 years or so, a little bit less than 100 years. And you see there that you've got roughly 50% being taken in the late 1920s at a sort of peak moment of inequality in the U.S. And then you have eventually the crash and then the New Deal and the beginning of World War II and everything that happened in that whole New Deal World War II system put in place a set of institutions and practices and policies and a variety of things which had the effect of reducing the share claimed by the top 10% and distributing it much more widely. That was the world that I grew up in. the world that you grew up in was roughly, how old are you? You're older than 10, right? What are you, about 15, 18? You're 18, you're 20, right? Something like that? 20. Fine. All right, so you grew up roughly here at a point when we were already on the way to levels of inequality which hadn't been seen in the U.S. in a century, and we're still there now. I don't blame your birth for this catastrophic increase in inequality. I blame your parents, I being one of them, you know, in a manner of speaking. But basically, we grew together for a long time, and we were very prosperous as a society from the close of World War II to the early 70s, and since then, we've basically been growing apart. Those are the numbers. So that's, I think, and then there's this thing. This is really interesting about the U.S. And it's a little bit distinctive to the U.S. You might say, well, of course you're going to have the rich people getting more, and you're going to have this increase in inequality, given the other numbers you just showed us. You have all this increased competition. Of course the effect of that is going to be to, make it worse for some people relative to others. Of course you're going to have growth in inequality. And there's a little something to that, but so little that it's hardly worth saying. Because when you compare the U.S. to other capitalist countries, you don't see these results. You just don't. The gains in the U.S. are very concentrated at the very top of the income pyramid. Top 1% takes 23% of income in the U.S. Top 0.1%. That's people making $1.7 million a year in 2006, a little bit more today. They take 9% of income. That's twice the 4.7% they take in UK. It's 5 times the 1.6% they take in France. Those are big differences in how rich people behave across countries. Here's some more composite things. This shows you those countries, thrown in Germany, Switzerland, Netherlands, Sweden, Spain, Italy, France. You could throw in more countries, but it would pretty much make the same point, that all of them had this decrease in equality. They've had some increase in recent years, but they're nowhere like where they were a long time ago, and they're nowhere near where the U.S. is. Nowhere. This is the top 10% of income share. In the U.S., again, it's around 50%. You can't find another developed country where it's anything approaching that. Or here's another way of putting the same numbers. Here's by different quintiles in the population. Quintiles, it's just a fifth. So we're up to the top 1%, and then the top 5 to read it here. 5 to 1%, and the top 10 to 5. Okay, and then you've got the top 20 to 10, and then the quintiles. Okay, 20%. So the fourth quintile, the middle quintile, the second quintile, and then the lowest quintile. And the numbers show that basically most of the action is here. You don't really see it that dramatically here. Or, here's yet another picture. This just takes the middle class itself, the middle, defined here just as the middle 60%, and then the bottom 20% in comparison to the top 1%. You see a difference? That's over. These are real numbers, by the way. I'm not doing anything funny with the numbers. I'm always giving you inflation-corrected numbers. I'm always giving you, as here, post-tax, post-transfer numbers. I'm doing this as honestly as the data permit you to be in seeing a picture. And the picture I'm telling you is that America distinctively had this tremendous growth in inequality with concentration at the very, very top. Those are the rich people I'm talking about who stole the country and now want us to bail them out further. Here's yet another way, and I don't want to overdo this or bore you to tears, but you could have a counterfactual, which might be instructive. You might say, okay, so you said the productivity continued to grow, but the distribution got all weird. Well, what if the distribution didn't get weird? What if, in fact, all the productivity gains and the growth in income and wealth that we'd seen since, say, the late 1970s, when we came on the scene, have been equally distributed? That's not what happened. That's what makes it a counterfactual. It's not the factual. But if that had happened, what would be the result for people in different quintiles? This is the post-tax, post-transfer income, and this number is the quintiles, 1 being lowest and 5 being highest. And this is the annual income, the average annual income for families in that quintile. Okay. Well, if you're in the first quintile, you'd be about 5.6. You'd have about $5.6 thousand more. if things have been equal than you have now. This is the real number. This is the effect. If you're in the second quintile, your family, post-tax and post-transfer. That's not what your folks earn, but what they have after taxes. Okay? And whatever benefits they get from the government, too. We're adding in the benefits, taking away the taxes. So post-tax, post-transfer. If they got about 30, 33, they'd be making about 8. They'd actually be more like, 41. A pretty big increase, right? We're talking about increases on the order of, 25, 30%. It gets smaller, bigger in the numbers, smaller in the percentage because the base is getting bigger. If you're in the right there, dead center in the income distribution, if you're in that third quintile family income now is about 65 or so before taxes, and afterwards you're around 50, roughly, and you'd actually be back at 60, which is if you hadn't paid any taxes at all, and then the fourth quintile and so on. Here's the people who'd be getting less. And notice that it's really only people at the very top. So again, the counterfactual is telling you what the facts tell you. That the people at the very top are the ones who got it, who got almost all the gain. That's the inequality. The American response to that was basically nothing, essentially, in public policy. These people organized well to dominate our public policy and execute a series of policies favorable to them and not favorable to other people. And the simplest way to show that is simply to look at where the money went and how much money there was. Let's start with how much money there was. The great American jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes once said that taxes are the price we pay for civilization. And the Irish playwright, poet, bon vivant, raconteur, etc., Oscar Wilde said, America is a distinguished country. It's the only one that went directly from barbarism to decadence without pausing for civilization. Civilization, you need some level of sort of public goods, stuff that people get through the government, the basic function of government being understood to protect and advance the interests of average people, average working people, average citizens, just out, not the super rich, but, average people, the great middle class, the great unwashed. Enable them to raise, get more opportunity and move up, but not get crushed by forces beyond their control. And to do that, you need to have some public goods. You need to have some education. You need to have some health care. You need to have other sorts of things. And you also need to have a series of things that people ordinarily spend a lot of money on in the U.S. that other people don't need to spend quite as much money on elsewhere because they're provided collectively. Things in transportation. And it's a bunch of other things you have to worry about in public goods. But here's the bottom line. Here's Europe with roughly the same GDP as the U.S. collectively. And it's competing fine. And there's the U.S. in terms of taxes. And here again, I'm being honest with you. These are OECD figures. If we use the IMF figures, they'd be slightly different, but nothing substantially different. Roughly speaking, there's about the rest. Europe spends, as you see here, roughly 13, 14, maybe even % more of its GDP on a weighted country average than the U.S. And what that means is, you can do the math. It's about a $15 trillion economy, so you're talking about something close to $3 trillion that would be available for public goods of various kinds. See what I'm doing there? So, roughly 15 times 15. I think it works out, doesn't it? So that would be 155 times. That would be roughly $2 trillion, right? Somebody with a better brain than mine. What is 15 times 15? It's 150 times plus 75. Oh, I'm sorry. So it's 225. Okay. So it's about $2 trillion plus dollars. But it's a lot of money is the point. $2 trillion available for public goods. That would mean, among other things, that all of you could go to college basically with no debt after you got graduated, and your graduate studies. It would mean you'd have health care and you wouldn't have to worry about that. It would mean, I know all of you like to drive your cars everywhere, even to and from classes, I understand, even if they're like 50 feet apart here on the campus. Which is preposterous, but, you're young, so you could be preposterous. But you might actually have a system in which you'd be encouraged to do something else. And you could actually go to cities and other places. You might be able to get around a little bit, more easily without driving a car. It would mean a lot of other things. There would be a variety of, it would mean that you would probably have, guaranteed training as an adult, and you'd have guaranteed vacation times. You'd have what elsewhere is called a social wage. That is a packet of benefits that you get just as being a citizen. It's a real value. Education, training, transit, other sorts of time off. If you're contemplating families, it would mean that you'd have support when you first start a family. All these countries have some manner of support, paid support for people just starting families. For the women, but also for the men. They encourage the men to get involved in the business of child rearing. Here it's essentially a private thing. Anyway, that's a social wage. Benefits that you get irrespective of your individual station, just as the right of being a citizen. And the bottom line, and this is what Oscar Wilde was getting at and that Holmes was getting at, is Europe has a much higher social wage than the U.S. It has a social wage. We basically don't have one. Here, more than anywhere else in the world, how you do depends on the quality of your job. And that's distinctive to the U.S. Now, the figures are actually, though, worse than what I suggested. It's not really 2.25. It's more like 3 trillion. Here's where I got the 3 trillion. Because we, unlike these people, spend a ton of that money on a particular sort of public good, namely the military. And there are people, argue about what that means and how much it is, but minimally you're talking about $400 to $500 billion a year, which gets you very close then back up near the $3 trillion. If we spent on the military at the rate that these other countries spend, there would be a lot more money available as well. All right, so I think of it really as more like 3 trillion and more like a really solid 15, 16 percentage point difference in terms of the amount that we spend on non-military public goods. That's the basic difference between America and the other places in terms of its fiscal performance. And one consequence of that might just be remarked, I don't want to scare you or bum you out or whatever. We talked about the end of the world and a bunch of other things so far, so this can't possibly bum you out. But one consequence of the American failure to spend on the public goods or to care much about what's happening to the general population has been our investments in education. And since we're at a university, let's just say it, it's sort of a cheap shot because these figures just came out. This is the Program in International Scholastic Achievement. This is a multi-nation thing that's done regularly. It's bought into by all these parties. We used to be on sort of shadow measures of this going back to the 50s. If we'd done this in the 1950s, the U.S. would be far and away at the very top. And here's where we are now. You can read the numbers as well as I, but if you say that, look, we want to preserve a standard of living, we want to get paid a lot of money, we are paid a fair amount of money, we want to compete with people who are paid, 1/10 or 1/20th what we are, they're operating with much better infrastructure at this point and aren't worrying about policing the rest of the world as we are, you might think, as most people do, well, it would be nice to be educated. At least it would be good for those people to be reasonably well educated. Well, they're not. And that's the current school system. So why did this happen exactly? Well, I basically think it's because we, the American people, allowed it to happen, which may, again, be a sort of simple story. We haven't built the thing that Lincoln was talking about. We haven't built a democratic movement or a democratic capacity. That was the task that remains before us, and we basically didn't do it in the last generation, which is when it was most urgently needed. Because in the last generation, what happened in the U.S. as you got more competition was that the sort of natural surplus that was in the U.S. You got to understand how unbelievably rich we were relative to other countries coming out of World War II. We were the only nation that was even prepared to field a wide variety of goods for export. We've been basically untouched. I know thousands of people had died, but nothing like what happened in Europe or Russia or Japan or other major powers. Our landmass, our basic factories were working fine at the end of the war, when other places were stinking ruins and smoking still, and children were starving in Europe and everything else. We were at such a strong position in that generation that I came into, the boomer, the tiresome boomer generation, the people born after the war, that basically there was so much abundance. It was almost anything we did, we could maintain a pretty high standard of living. We were so dominant in so many industries, so dominant militarily, so much richer than everybody else. And so we sort of, took the eye off the ball, or never really had the eye on the ball, of paying attention to organizing a society fit to live in. which is really the point of democracy. Basically, we don't have that. When you look around, we simply don't have the sort of basic infrastructure that you would need in order to steer American politics in a better direction than it's taken. Now, what do I mean by this political infrastructure? Here's an acronym for you. CBS, M to the power of 4, which is a ridiculous mnemonic. But as you get older, you lose your mind, and you'll look more and more for little mnemonics to recall things. And what these are, this is what I'd say to you, these are sort of 7 habits of highly successful social movements or democratic societies. There are 7 functional capacities of any successful democratic politics. And by democratic politics, I mean a politics which is aiming at what Lincoln talked about, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. I'm down with that. I think that's fine. That's enough for me in terms of defining democracy, okay? You can get fancy. You can say democracy is a social order which is characterized by the people being free and equal in determining the conditions of their own association. And it's a beautiful ideal, and I think it's a very, very attractive ideal. But in terms of functioning stuff, day to day, you mean basically the society is run for, by, and of the people. The basic Lincoln thing, I think, is fine. If you want that in today's society, you got to have these sorts of capacities because it's not going to arrive independently. Just not a natural consequence of just not doing anything, just showing up at the voting booth and just saying, okay, fine, I ratify that. It's just not going to happen. The forces that are arrayed against its happening are far too great for it to be, a natural consequence of that sort of non-bargaining. You actually have to push at it. It's like equality and goodness and most good things in life, love and patriotism and friendship and a decent community, and you got to aim at it in order to get it. It's not going to happen. The cliche, it takes a village to raise a child, and it probably takes a union to get a raise. It takes a culture to really keep a society intact, and you got to be participants in that. When Rousseau said that when active citizenship ceases to be the chief task of adulthood, well, then the society is on its way to ruin. You'll have mercenaries to fight your wars and politicians to sell the country. You got to be involved in some way. I'm not talking about day in, day out, rather than do your everyday work or whatever it is you're doing. But you got to have some sort of connection to the politics of the society, and this describes what those connections are, and also the means of moving the politics. What are these 7 things? Well, if you want to actually do something in politics, you got to be able to communicate to your membership, to and from your base, with the mass public. You got to have ways of doing that. Maybe Arianna Huffington taking over AOL's news service is going to get that for people. But basically, people who don't like democracy, I'll take Fox News as among the people who really don't like democracy in the sense that we're talking about it. They've got mechanisms to get the word out, and people who like democracy basically don't. You got to have some sort of coordination among your leadership. You must have noticed that people who describe themselves as progressives or liberals or on the left, or I'll just call them Democrats or progressives broadly, by which I don't mean that they're separate from liberals. Yeah, they're liberals too. They're tax and spend liberals. They want to, actually build a society. Fine. Liberals, progressives, call them what you want. Okay. But those people they say different things all the time. You don't quite understand what they're saying half the time. On the other side, people are saying the same thing repeatedly. It's very disciplined. They got great message discipline, and they're coordinated. People on, and I'll call the liberal, progressive people left, and the other people right sometimes, just for shorthand. The left basically behaves like a bunch of sick people stealing each other's medicine, so far as I can see, or they're a firing squad shaped in a circle. They're not really coordinated, and they don't talk well to the rest of the public. That's communication. You need blood, as in new blood, as in like people like you. Well, not all of you. I see some people, my age and even possibly older in the audience, but people in the like 18, 20. When you're first entering serious adulthood, and you're thinking, okay, so what am I going to do with my life? What sort of career am I going to have? Who am I going to get, hooked up with in a more permanent way? What do I really want to do with my life? This is the great thing about being your age. That decision is still ahead of you. And then let me tell you, you've got all the choices in the world right now, and over time they'll get narrower and narrower and narrower until you get to death, and that's the only choice. right now is a great time, right? This is what's great about being young. It's not that you're smarter than older people, or that you're more beautiful or healthier. You're certainly not smarter. You are better looking and healthier because you're younger, that's fine. But what's great is that you've got all these possibilities right now, and they're not confined at all. Don't waste this time. I'm sorry to sound like your parents, but really, it's true. Don't waste it. That will go. Anyway, and you want to get these young people in. The other great thing about young people is they don't know what they're doing, and they have a lot of free time. And they're cheap labor. And because they're not trained, they don't have, high, they're not that expensive in labor markets, and you get them in. And any social movement does this. It tries to get young people in and gets them involved in something. And it doesn't necessarily have to take over their whole life again. Indeed, it's very, very important if it's a mature movement that it not take over all their life. You say, okay, I want you to, be a Gettysburg carrier. I want you to be a modern patriot. I want you to fight for democracy in America. You say, okay, but I got my classes and I got this and that and I got a girlfriend or a boyfriend. I got to do this and that. Maybe I have a little baby. Maybe I got to go to law school. Blah blah blah. And if I say, oh, well, then you cannot be a patriot, then the movement dies. What the movement has to say is, of course you do, and that's great. And so here's how you can do that plus do this. We're going to make it easy for you. We're going to mentor you. We're going to help you. And we're not going to indoctrinate. We're going to explode your mind and expand it. And you're going to be here to replace us. We're not going to boss you around the rest of your life. We're here to help you grow because we're going down. We're the old people. And that encouraging approach to youth is very, very important in a successful movement. And then you need the 4 M's, the big M. You need a message. You need to have something that you're for. Martin Luther King didn't give a great speech saying, I have a complaint. And he said, I have a dream. Here's the dream. I want, all these children. I want people to be judged by the quality of their character. I want people to come together in this or that way. You got to have some sort of positive thing that you're saying, simple and positive, to say what it is that you're for, and a few things to get you closer to that. You don't want to make it too complicated. You don't want to have a wish list. I want everything in the world. I want everything from the end of Afghanistan to this new deal in Iran to this deal in Tunisia, this deal in Europe, this deal over the children of East Timor, this on unions, this on that. Of course you want all these different things, but don't list the whole thing first. Just keep it simple, stupid. That's the basic KISS principle of organizing. Keep it simple, stupid. 3 or 4 things that will get you closer to where you want to go. You need a lot of messengers. A ton of messengers. People who look sort of like the other people in the country. Diverse people talking in public, running for office, message discipline in their frames, etc. You need some models. You need some examples of stuff that works. Cool things to do. I'll talk later. Let's retrofit all buildings in America. It would pay for itself. It would probably help on global warming, give people a ton of jobs, make people inside the buildings more productive. It wouldn't cost any public money. The banks are willing to loan on it. Let's get organized to do that. What's not to like? Or let's do this, or let's do that. Just ideas, concrete ideas that you can try out, show that work at scale, and that you can push. And then you need some money. You don't need quite as much money as you might think you need, but you need a fair amount of money. The spirit must become flesh at some point. And you want that money to be committed to experiment and performance, and prepared to withdraw when it fails. You want to make big investments in different people and organizations and see what works, and like that. And then there's a sort of residual category here. I call them service centers. These are basically anything that doesn't quite fit here, which is maybe why people say, oh, everything's on this list, because anything that doesn't fit. But I mean a little bit more precisely. These are, on a variety of functions best organized in one place for economies of scale, doing it one place in the center, brings down your cost, then the cost of distribution are less than the cost of production. Or scope. There might be 5 or 6 things that need to get coordinated in one place, and it's good to get them all together. And think, leadership academies, training people and stuff, policy shops, different things, think tanks specializing in this or that, centers for campaign expertise of different sorts, media support centers of different kinds, blah, blah, blah. But, call those service centers. CBS M to the power of 4. And what's striking about the U.S. is that the right, what I'll call the right, By here, I don't mean people with horns, but just just on the simplified spectrum. All right, the liberal progressives here, more corporate-oriented, forward, anti-democratic forces here. That's the right. They have all these structures, all these institutions. They built them very systematically. They started building them in the late 60s, continued building them in the 70s and 80s, and they saw the ascension of Ronald Reagan, and then, as basically their first major victory, and have scored repeated victories ever since. The basic program of that group is, you could describe it in American historical terms, they want to repeal the New Deal, basically. They want to go back to an America in which you have essentially unconstrained corporate power, basically dominating, running the society, simply put. And there's a famous memorandum that Lewis Powell, who later went on to the Supreme Court, wrote for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, I guess in the late 60s, early 70s. Does anyone remember when the Powell Memorandum was authored? Was it late 60s? It was before Nixon came in, right? Yeah, so it's late 60s. And you go on, you could find it. It's a brilliant little memo. It's not that long. And he just says, he's speaking basically for business. He's asked by the American Chamber of Commerce, what should we do? We got students, protesting the war, and black people talking about civil rights, and what's going on here? Oh, and women saying, look, we don't want to just go to college and then go back and, put biscuits in the oven and our buns in the bed and just, raise babies and have tea parties. We want to actually get out involved in the labor force. And people say, oh, my God, what's happening? This is terrible. And Powell said, yeah, it is terrible. It's very threatening. So what you should do is get a lot of money together and get a lot of academics, get a lot of communication, recruit people, get your blood, your message, your messengers, your models, etc., and go do it. And he doesn't use exactly this language, but read the thing and check it against your memory of what I'm saying here, and I think you'll find it's pretty much this track. And they did it. Basically, they made the investment. And the left didn't. It's not as if it didn't know this was happening, it just didn't have itself organized enough. It just didn't do it. It was fighting with itself. It was doing other stuff. It was distracted. It thought the right wasn't serious. They were wrong. It just didn't make the investment. That's my basic view of why, in many ways, we're in the peculiar shape we're in. Of course, it gets more complicated. Now, let's bring it up to date a little bit. Then came the financial collapse, the post-Lehman, post-2008 thing. And this is a very big thing, and I know you're going to be talking about this a lot more in the next special sessions, right? I don't want to steal the thunder from all these people, and I don't think you guys need to be told a lot about this. This is a very, very big thing, big mondo big. 2009 was the first year in the post-World War II era when global output and per capita income actually declined. First year, trade fell 25%. That's the biggest decline since World War II. Countries lost several years of potential output. We've lost several years of potential output, actually. People talk about the Japan lost decade. Our GDP now, even in recovery, we're back to 2006 levels. We're not doing so great. We basically haven't grown at all in the U.S. in the last 5 years. Those are the declines. Investment fell. External debt also fell. Maybe that's good, as did current account imbalances. In the U.S., here's the bottom line on what happened. Simplifying a lot of stuff. So in the U.S., here's what happened. Basically, you lost about $12 trillion in housing value and stock wealth. That's a lot of money. And then you had direct losses in construction because there weren't, as there were, any houses to build. And that reduced annual consumption about $1.1 trillion. That was the drop in basically demand. ARRA responded to this. ARRA refers to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the Recovery Act, or the stimulus, as it's often called. Obama's stimulus package. That's what this was. It was $787 over 2 years. 2 years. So what is that? It's 433.5 a year. That's compared to this. right? So it's basically 1/3 of the sort of gap that you wanted to fill. It was a relatively modest effort. It went into tax breaks to better off people, aid to states whose budgets were crashing, infrastructure and science, and most of that's still not spent, by the way, education and health, this sort of stuff. Government debt that was privately owned exploded also during this period. But it's important for you as thinking people to separate the effects of different things that went on. In January, but let me just tell you what the debt was. In January 1988, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, projected debt in 2018. This is debt from the government, stuff the government, wants you to cover in some way, owned privately, not owned by the Federal Reserve, not owned by another part of government, but net private debt owned by government, or the government debt owned by individuals. And that was estimated in 2008. So this is during Bush 2, Bush 43, not George Herbert Walker Bush, but George W. Bush. As going by 2018, so in 7 years, roughly around the time you get out of school and are working on your next thing, okay? A couple years after you graduate, I hope. That was projected to be about $5.1 trillion. That'd be about 23% of GDP. That is now projected to be $13.7 trillion, or 65% of GDP. Big jump, right? 40% jump. You get it? Where did that come from, though? Well, it wasn't from TARP. It wasn't from the Troubled Assets Relief Program, even though you hear this. Now, I know you guys hear this all the time. It was TARP and the stimulus. Obama is destroying our future. Obama. There are a couple of mistakes here. One is Obama wasn't TARP. TARP was pre-Obama. But leave that aside. Okay? Tim Geithner was certainly TARP, and you can blame Obama for appointing Geithner as secretary. But the TARP bailout, as disgusting as many of you may find it, and I'm among you in finding it disgusting in terms of the lack of conditions put on the banks, as a fiscal matter, just fiscal, not morality, not socking it to the people who destroyed the economy and now are making billions off your backs, not that, but just as a fiscal matter, really not a big deal. Really. They gotten the money back. They may have gotten it back by, enriching themselves, but the money has gotten back. So it's not TARP. And it's also not the stimulus, really. That's not true in the U.S. It's certainly not true in the G20, the top 20 countries. IMF just did a survey of that. The stimulus efforts were only about 1/10 the increased indebtedness. So where did all this indebtedness come from? That's a huge increase in indebtedness. That's staggering. 40% of GDP. So where did it come from, if not from the obvious things? Where did it come from? It came from the fact that the economy itself crashed. When an economy crashes, what happens? It means the government has to spend, by law, certain things on certain people. Not a lot in the U.S., but some. And it means its tax revenues go down. Basically, revenue decline, that accounts for 57% of the increased debt. Interest payments on the debt, there's more debt, so more interest payments. They account for another 14% of the increase. Discretionary spending, mostly in error, that's 17%. That's more than the G20 average. We did spend more. But nothing like what you hear all the time on the radio. Now, why do we spend this money for? Well, we spent this money to bail out some banks that had taken a bunch of money and behaved in really risky and almost criminal ways that wrecked the world economy, brought it to its knees. They are doing fine now. They're back fully. And this is where the crudeness of the what happened comes in. A bunch of rich people hijack the country, and now they want us to do it again. And they want us to give them a bunch of money for doing it again. And they got a lot of money from the feds. They got, I guess, $13 trillion in guarantees, but actual transfers of about $3 trillion. We threw a lot of liquidity at them. We stood them up again, and now they're operating again. They're getting tremendous returns. They're fine. Labor's not back. Capital, labor, remember, two different classes? Labor's really not back in the U.S. Trade's sort of resuming. Global imbalances are growing again. A bunch of people are responding to increased economic activity and worries about what the next round of government leveraging, i.e. taking on debt to bail out banks that they anticipate in the future is coming, he's going to do, and there's a lot of speculation, commodity prices. Believe it or not, some of the stuff that's going on in Egypt has some relation to some of these global financial flows. But the emerging market economies pretty clearly are going to lead in the future, and that's evident in the growth. Emerging market economies is a term that people use. They used to call them third world economies, and before that they called them really poor economies or less developed economies. Now they're all emerging market economies. Many of them are still dirt poor, but they're certainly less poor than they were before, and they're much more powerful actors relative to us. That's that doubling stuff again and the investments that they're making. The world is looking different. It will look different in 10 years, 20 years for you than it did for the previous generation. Fundamentally different. I wouldn't, if I were you, start demonizing kids in China who want a life as good as you. You should be aware that they are there and they're coming. They do want the life. And it's going to be more difficult if, as residents of the U.S., what are we, about 310 million people in a 6.8 billion world, so a little bit less than 5% for us to continue to consume, 25, 30% of the resources, several times how much the rest of the world gets. Out sharing the stuff a little bit. Thinking about other people a little bit. Anyway, we digress. But the Arrow funds are now pretty much spent. The states are strapped. Professor Gordon was telling me the cover of The Economist is sort of a funny thing this week. It just has all these states defined in terms of debt, like IOU, Iowa, or whatever. I don't know. The states are broke. And so you might say, okay, that's great. What me worry, Alfred E. Newman. All right, so that's where we're at right now. And on the banks, don't believe me, talk to Jamie Dimon, the head of J.P. Morgan Chase. Says, yeah, it's probably going to happen again. Yeah. 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, I don't know. But yeah, it'll probably be another crisis. Yeah. Just like the one we just had. And what that will do, if you don't do something about that, that'll risk another 40% jump. You're going to have another balance sheet recession, which the government has basically spent a lot of money to dig both the banks, but more importantly, the economy out of, and it's had a tremendous collapse in its revenues, is struggling to right the economy, and then it's getting pressure to cut its own revenues again. And you have the contingent liability, you can call it that, of another financial crisis right on the horizon. Those discussions are going around something called Basel III, just an agreement about international financial regulation, and it can't be very promising if you follow that stuff. Because the banks are resisting the higher capitalization requirements, they're resisting a lot of the regulation stuff. They're saying, we really appreciate what you did, but if you actually read the text and read what's been agreed to, and it's not very impressive. So basically, you're suffering through a world economy and an American economy that's been wrecked by a bunch of too-big-to-fail banks that don't show any particular interest in changing their behavior. Bottom line. They may be nice about it, but they expect to do it again. All right. And then came the midterm. So American policy, people reacted to that and they said, wow, this is terrible. Obama spent all this money and the economy still stinks. These banks are so mean and terrible, but you haven't punished them at all. Of course that people were mad. People say, the Tea Party, a bunch of racist people. I don't think so. I think people were just upset. They just thought, what the hell is this? This is not the hope we can believe in. I thought this guy was going to change stuff in Washington, but nothing seems to be happening. And then, of course, they were, hopelessly misled and abused in interrogation by the whole, what Hillary Clinton called the vast right-wing conspiracy. I won't call it that, but I would see a pretty well-organized attack machine systematically misleading people. Now, be honest. I know you're all geniuses, right? Assume that what I just said was true. It is true. That neither TARP nor the stimulus had very much at all to do with our deficit. How many of you think that they had a lot to do with the deficit before you came in here? Really? One. Only one person. The rest of you all thought it was a function of declining revenues and interest on the increased debt. I don't believe you. I don't believe you. Now, come on, you can be honest. Are you telling me that coming in here, you didn't think that the stimulus and the TARP, the bailout to the banks, was part of the reason why we have all this debt? You didn't think that. You never thought that. Okay, well, you're very advanced. That's funny because 85% of Americans think that. So you must be that sheltered. They're geniuses. What can I say? I got nothing more to offer. Okay, Great, that's terrific. Well, then you also know this analysis and why the Democrats lost the midterms. Okay, and we could probably skip this part too, I guess. Okay, so what are you for? Well, if you know all this, what are you interested in? Well, let's go back just for a second. A lot of people say that Obama's to blame for this, and in substantial measure, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think there's a lot of stuff he could have done, but this is sort of a sympathetic thing that he inherited a very, very bad situation. It was pretty constrained, and this is the important point that no president, not even a really good-looking, articulate guy with a brilliant smile who was a real smarty pants, ran the Harvard Law Review and all that. No president can do stuff on its own. Presidents need people behind them. And there are basically only two forces in the world. There's organized money. Don't worry, it always gets organized. And then there's organized people. And if the people are not organized to push for something, it's very unlikely that you're going to get more than middling results from politics, no matter how dramatic the reform looks in the first instance. It's very, very unlikely. If you say, hi, okay, I want to roll the pharmaceutical companies and have Medicare for all, and it's going to take down in a substantial way vested interests that account for somewhere between 10 and 15% of the total economy right now. I'm just going to tell them to go away, and I'm going to deal with them somehow. And I'm going to have this one president do it, and think that they're not going to have major effect on the Congress of the United States, and not have anything else to offer, and just say, okay, so just go do that. That's pretty implausible. If you say, hi, here are these banks that the year before the crash got 45% of corporate profits that brought the economy to its knees, I'm just going to discipline them. I'm going to nationalize them all, and I'm going to break them down into little microbes, and I'm going to put them in jail and whatever. But you don't have any sort of social pressure to do that? Very unlikely it's going to happen. So basically, again, I come back to the lack of any sort of really democratic movement pushing this thing as the real explanation. All right, so let's assume that, though, you're people of good heart, and you do believe in the Gettysburg Address or something like it. And here's basically what you want. You want sort of equal protection, equal opportunity. That requires democratic action, not just markets. If you want to get fancy, you want something like this. I think this is what we all want. I'm getting a little worried about time, and I don't want to maybe... How are we doing on time? We've used up, about 50 minutes already? Are you bored? Are you okay? Yeah? Really? Yeah? Okay. I'm going to take you at your word, but I also took you at your word when you said, oh yeah, I knew all that about the financial crisis too. That just shows what a sucker I am. So here I'm double suckering you. I'm going to assume that you're interested. I'm going to keep talking. Okay? Fooled me once, shame on... Yeah, okay. Basically... You want, in fact, to build a bunch of infrastructure to support the education, the innovation, this much abused word, and other stuff to actually add value and produce things that other people are going to be interested in buying. That's true. You want deep equality of opportunity, which I think goes well beyond the educational, some measure of educational equality. You want, I think, pretty strongly to encourage social contribution. You don't want to. I don't think, especially in the U.S., you can't build a substantial investment in those public goods I was talking about if people think it's just a bunch of slackers and lazy people sucking at the public tit, right? And they're really not doing anything. They're useless people. You're not going to get majority support. So you have to actually show people making contribution in some way. They got to be doing something, not just sitting on their hands. And you want to encourage that. You want to also, though, get the citizens more involved. You want to get the states involved, the progressive federalism. You want to get your taxes in order in different ways. And I really don't have time to go through all this, but if you want any questions, we'd be happy to talk about it. But I think there are a variety of relatively straightforward solutions to any worries you have or might have about how we could balance out these sorts of expenditures with the revenues that we expect. If you wanted to simplify it to zero, do not worry much about Social Security. Worry a lot about Medicare and health care. That's on the social expenditure side. Do not worry about getting an education. It will pay for itself. I don't know how, but it will. And what we should do is like what other countries do. We just have it paid for by you over your future earnings. If you're not willing to pay taxes, you American people, then get the debt off the kids and just have them pay some portion as a percentage of earnings. And if people make a lot of money, they'll wind up paying back more. Okay, pool the insurance risk of a future good life. But get the debt out of young people graduating from college so that they're not making stupid decisions based on carrying all this stupid debt. If you just, and get the kids ready for college. You take care of the kids very early on. A lot of early childhood education stuff, a lot of nutrients, just, it's pretty basic stuff, actually. Surround the kid with a little loving environment and some decent food, make sure they don't get shot on the way to school, get them ready for school, let the school be free, and put them to work. And then tax the hell out of them for the next generation. That's the basic thing. But it's going to be fine, and the numbers all work. All right, so how might you get there? Well, you need a strategy, and you might want to know, so what's a strategy? Well, strategy, minimally, it's a plan of action with a goal. Can't get somewhere where you don't know where you're going. Or you might get there, but it's not as a result of, your reflection beforehand. You want a clearly defined goal, some sort. And you want clear and plausible incremental steps to get in there. Remember I said about the message stuff? You don't want to say 10 million things, nothing's plausible, but we're for them all. You want something that makes sense, that we could do, where you can make some progress. And ideally, you want each step to make it easier to take the next one. George Bush's father used to call that the big bow, or momentum. You want, or if you want to get fancy, you say, Hache, El Camino al Andar, or something. You can see how bad my Spanish pronunciation and words are. But you sort of pave the road as you move it. And then you want a basic message on reality that you can communicate to people that makes sense of it for them. Doesn't matter where you start, but that you start with some sort of shared clarity on aims and means. Courage, conviction, that would help too. Anybody who says ideas don't matter, you need some ideas. You shouldn't just say, hey, let's have a meeting, let's have a march. You gotta have something you're for. And you can't just be more grievances than ideas. You gotta have some positive suggestions again. But anybody who thinks the best idea always wins, based on the history of the last 30 years, where all this stuff has been talked about, and endless progressive programs have been offered that actually, in retrospect, made much, 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 infinitely more sense than what was enacted. If you think ideas alone win, you're stupid. You're silly. What is the right strategy? It's simple. End all social constraints on capital. Period. The steps are pretty straightforward. Deregulate business. This so long precedes your life, you couldn't probably remember when they were regulated. Demonize and starve government. Waste, fraud, and abuse. Government is a bunch of waste, fraud, and abuse. Don't spend on government. Crush unions. Look at what your new governor just did with the PLAs in, some city in Iowa. What was the city? What? Cedar Rapids. Unbelievable. He was like a middle of the road Republican governor last time he was here, and this time he's like a, little, out there. He's just saying, don't do that. You can't do that. I'm going to not allow you to have it. Not allow you to have unions involved in this thing under a project labor agreement. That's pretty amazing. Probably illegal too, but the fact that he feels all right, anyway. So crush unions, regressively redistribute income and wealth. We saw that. That was pretty good, right? Etc. Now, what is the effect of that if you do those things? Well, each step increases material uncertainty and reduces your capacity, social capacity, to relieve it. And the basic message, I think, of the right is not, what would Jesus do, or we all got to read Hayek together, and markets are really better than any other form of governance, and all that other stuff that you hear. It's really, you're on your own, and anyone who tells you different is a liar. I think that's the basic message. And basically, increasingly, you are. So it makes sense of reality. Who among you really trusts anybody outside your family to do something with politically? They've won. That's the point. So what's the alternative to that? Well, you can start with the economy, because any politics you do has to have something to say about the economy, and it better make sense to work. Because if you really don't have an economic plan or an economic strategy, no one's going to take you seriously at all. I would start by saying, look, there are two ways you can compete in this economy. I'm going to call one the high road, nice, and one the low road. One's good for workers, the other's not. One's sustainable, the other's not. One's socially accountable, the other's not. Both are profitable, can be profitable. Lots and lots of instances of both being profitable. Then you start with the applying a strategy. And it's pretty easy to. Well, we'll come back to that. Okay, we'll come back to that. You need to have a picture of how you could apply this strategy to place. So you need to have a view of, well, what actually makes a place wealthy? And here's what makes a place wealthy. And this place could be, I don't know, this city, or Iowa, or the United States, or the world. It doesn't really, you have to have some constraints on the space but only to the extent that you have effect on that space. But any place, any community that you can define, I wouldn't start defining it as the world. Let's start with Iowa, or wherever you wind up living, or go to the U.S. or whatever. It's basically the productivity. It's productivity. Productivity of its human, physical, natural capital. And productivity I take to be just a function of the money value of the goods and services produced. The people willing to pay for, their uniqueness, their performance, whatever. And the efficiency of that production. This is all very standard stuff. That's the output per unit of input. And I would measure productivity, if I were doing it, as revenue per unit of input, not output per unit. Because you want to get the money, okay? You want to grow the wealth, you want to get it. And what matters is not what industries you worry about, but how firms compete, and there's a bunch of other stuff. But keep your eye on the prize of productivity. You want to add value by increasing productivity, okay? And now what makes a place, that's what makes a place rich. What makes it worth fighting for is democracy. We talked about that. Community of free equals, enjoying equal protection. Some sort of shared, sustainable prosperity. So you want high and rising living standards rather than unequal and dropping living standards. And that's about it. Equal opportunity, decent standard of life. Good place to live, work, and play. That's one cliche, one way of putting this. Communities which are inclusive, competitive, and sustainable, well-run, that'd be another way of putting it. I'm calling all that high road, okay? It's competitive, but it pays a decent wage. It's not environmentally destructive, and it has some social accountability. You with me? Okay. And a high road society, place then is one which uses democratic power and organization to do that. And your question should be, how on earth do you think that might possibly be possible in the U.S.? Oh, and it would do this too. It would basically move you from poverty to productivity, isolation to connectedness, all this beautiful stuff. It sort of thinks of democracy as like land, labor, and capital, as sort of a force of production, a real factor in production. And what does this choice look like again, a little bit more precisely? Well, the low road basically, and talk to any business people they'll say, yeah, I can compete on price, I can compete on quality, performance. You're just saying productivity is a way of registering that quality and performance. Firms know this. Competing on price means you try to drop the price as low as possible. And what you try to do in part is to shove the cost of production onto other people. You don't pay your taxes, that cuts your cost. You don't clean up your waste, that reduces your cost. You crush your unions, that reduces your cost. You pay your workers as little as possible, that reduces your cost. You source the work all over the world to the most desperate workers, that reduces your cost. And then you screw the people transporting it, that reduces your cost. As you see from the description, it's not really a recipe for social happiness. It leads to economic insecurity, rising inequality, poisonous labor relations, little firm commitment to place, environmental damage. What's the high road? What's this heavenly high road thing? Well, it means you basically compete on productivity. You try to improve the quality of your technology. You get the most out of your natural resources. You get the most out of your people. You train them. You do all these things. Continuous improvement, better trained and equipped workers, system-wide reduction of waste, public goods to get these things. And then it produces higher worker incomes, profits, reduced environmental damage, something much better than what we have now. It's not that hard to distinguish the high road from the low road. You can sort of see it. Here's a picture of two animals. They're the same animals. Can you distinguish them at all? One's the high road, one's the low. You're getting tired, huh? You poor things. All right. Oh, come on. All right. Here's the question about feasibility. Why do we think that we could possibly do this in the U.S.? Do you agree that if we could get to high road, that would be good, rather than low road? All right. And if we could show the worth of democracy in the economy in the way that it does, that would be cool. Good. It would give us some credibility. Maybe give us some confidence to build that infrastructure we talked about. You agree that infrastructure sort of would be a useful set of tools to have? You know, it's sort of very hard to go into a fight with both hands tied behind your back. Basically what the left is doing relative to the right. So you agree with all that. So, but why believe that it's possible? Here's why. Because we know we can do it. We just haven't done it at any scale. It is, in fact, possible to increase productivity very dramatically in firms. We've done that repeatedly. We just haven't done it with enough firms. It's not even that costly. We just haven't done it. Literally. We just haven't done it. I'll show you some numbers. It's possible to reduce a huge amount of waste that's in our economy. That's sort of left over from the habits we developed when you had that big surplus. We're just sort of, big, fat, and ugly, and happy, and, striding the world like a giant colossus, and, having fun, and wasting stuff all over the place, and not actually keeping track of stuff. Huge amount of waste. Huge amount of waste. You get rid of that, penny saved is a penny earned. If you don't spend that, that's more wealth. You can raise wages, you can reduce the cost of living. Same effect for workers. We know also the economy is largely regional, and regions can in fact be organized. We have the power in regions to organize them. And you can organize them in part by building that productive infrastructure. That's that build a high road here piece that you read. And that tends to root firms in place. Here's the variation in firm productivity. This is a very basic, that's the NAICS, stands for National North American Industrial Classification System. 332116 is metal stamping. That's pretty basic stuff. That's taking one piece of metal and hitting another one. Stamping. Sometimes you use other than metal to do the stamping. That's pretty basic. On the bottom you see what the value added is per worker. How much revenue? What's the ad, basically, the firm gets per worker? Notice that ranges from a low of whatever this is, like 30,000, 25,000, way up there, 400,000, in the most basic industry. If you have that sort of variation in that most basic industry, dimes and donuts, that means you can be assured you have it in a variety of other industries as well. Every industry I've looked at, certainly you didn't see ranges quite this dramatic, but you saw very dramatic ranges. And that's good news. Most U.S. firms are here and sort of here. That's about half the firms right there, obviously. You can move them here. How do you get here to here? Partly by having these people do what these people do. This is not exactly rocket science, although it appears to be much more difficult than rocket science given the speed at which we're doing it. That's what other countries do. They say, we can help you get here. Would you like to get here, or would you like to die? Because we want you to pay your workers more. We will help you, but a condition of helping you is that you make an effort to get here. If you don't know how, we will show you. That's what Germany does, that's what France does, that's what China does, that's what everybody except the U.S. does. It's called upgrading, modernization, industrial policy. Ooh, that's a terrible word. It just means using the state to help the economy increase the value added per worker. That's all it means. It doesn't mean picking winners and losers. It means moving the economy up rather than down a certain value chain or value pyramid. Interestingly, in the U.S., the productivity of these firms is not directly related to the size of the firms. You're thinking, boy, I couldn't do that in some sort of small screw shop in Iowa City. You might not, but it's not going to be because of the size of the firm. It's going to be because of the stupidity of the management or the opposition. It's not the size of the firm that drives this. You can have firms that are very small that get the same sort of productivity effects. The size of the firms, this is plant size I don't know if you can read this. Plant size is in black. But then ownership is this. The large companies tend to win here. It's not because of the size of the plant. It's because they have better managers. So basically what you want to do is to get small firms, if you're worried about small firms, the quality of management that is available from larger companies. But there's no question that they can become more productive. So much on productivity. Now let's talk about waste. Here's what Americans spend. This is 2008, I think, data. That's the middle quintile. That's the range of the middle quintile. Okay, remember that absolute middle, the third quintile? However you count from top or bottom. That's the middle of the middle class. That's a household. And here's what they spend money on. At 25%, this is on average, 25% on housing, 18% on transportation, utility bills, healthcare. So 60% is housing, transportation, energy, or health. Okay? In each of those, there are areas of tremendous waste. Tremendous. You get rid of the waste, which we know how to do. That means that their living standards go up. Right? They have lower cost of living. Here's the cost in metropolitan areas. Notice that actually housing or transportation exceeds it for working families. Those are the cars you're driving around. Here's the relationship of household consumption and transportation as we currently have it organized in the U.S. and wealth. Notice it's as inverse as you possibly could imagine. Here are the gains you would get by making it possible for people just to have one less car. Let's not say, you can't have any cars. That would be like saying to politicians, you've got to be honest. How about we just say, well, how about one less car? Or how about just a little less corruption? Just to moderate your demands. And you can easily do that. It would involve taking control about how you're spending on your transportation infrastructure and what roads you're building and how much transit and so on and so forth. What if you took seriously the idea that in the next, I don't know, certainly by the time you're my age or before, actually, we're going to basically rebuild America in terms of its building stock. Why not make that all green, if you want, and retrofit all the buildings? That'd be a cool thing to do. It'd save us tons of money on energy. Oh, and let's talk about energy. You want to talk about energy? Good, let's talk about energy. I'd like to talk about energy. Here's our energy flow. Just a nice little spaghetti diagram. That's coal. Here's some of this here. That's nuclear. That's oil and gas. This is the stuff that the lefties are all excited about. Oh, here's your ethanol. Thank you for your presidential primaries. We have a bunch of ethanol subsidized endlessly. Here is hydro. Where is solar? Hardly even on the map. You notice that? Where is wind? It's hardly even on the map. You notice that? That's because solar and wind are together less than 2% of overall energy consumption. That's how little we're doing on these obvious renewables. But leave aside any concerns about that and why you might want to possibly begin to match what other countries are doing in those major areas of possible activity. What if you just didn't want to throw money out the window willy-nilly? This map should bother you because it tells you that of the 100 quads, that's a quadrillion BTUs. Quadrillion is 1,000 trillions. A trillion is 1,000 billions. You take it up and backwards there. BTU, you know what that is? It's a British thermal unit. It's the equivalent of, 252 calories and 1/3 of a watt. You can convert the things in different ways. I hope there's some engineers around here. But just think of it as a lot of energy, okay? And it's denominated as billions of, or quads, or quadrillions of BTUs. We consume as a country about 100 quads a year. And basically half of it is lost. That's how inefficient we are. That's a lot of money, guys. That's well over $1 trillion right there. That's just lost. Where's it lost? It just goes out in heat. It just gets lost. It gets lost in transmission. Some of that's irreducible. Some of it gets lost in generation. In generation alone, we waste more electricity, or more power than Japan uses in an entire year. Japan's a big country, it's a small island nation, but they're pretty well organized, and you think they have a lost decade and stuff, but, they still got a GDP of about $6 trillion. It's pretty considerable. That entire economy is powered by the amount of money, amount of energy that we lose in one subsector of our energy. I'm just trying to make the point. There's a lot of waste. If you get rid of the waste, there's money. Healthcare. These are old figures. I meant to update this. This is 2003. It looks much worse now, actually. But here's a way to try to think about the healthcare sector. We are so far out of line with other countries and what we cost per capita. I've tried to correct it every possible way. Purchasing power parity, okay? Just comparing with other rich countries with really good data. Here are the countries. You can look it up. We're here. They're almost all here. That's $1 trillion there. Okay, now, could we do this, though? Okay, so, you persuaded me, okay? There's waste. We could increase productivity. We could add value. We could decrease waste, okay? Well, but what about this region stuff? Isn't the world flat? Aren't we competing neck and neck with some poor Indian child coming into Bangalore to screw us, huh? Or some child from China coming into a big city trying to take our jobs? Yes and no. Yes and no. They would like a life approximating the luxury in which they see you living. In that sense, you're competing. On the other hand, they're also human beings, so you might want to think about just, treating them as that for a second, not just out of decency, but your self-interest, because if they're human beings, they probably have a brain too. You might actually learn something from them. They might invent something that you could use that would make your life better. That's called gains from trade. So I wouldn't get too freaky on the trade stuff. But let's just do the basic world is flat. It's going to slide on this frictionless flat surface. The economy goes anywhere. And what can you say about that is that it's, there's that view and then there's reality. Here's the actual structure of the world economy. Notice it's very concentrated in places. Those are the top 100 metros in the U.S. They're on 12% of the land mass of the U.S. That's 80% of the economy right there. That's organizable. That's pretty concentrated. 12% of the land mass of the U.S. 80% of the economy. Yeah. And these metroeconomic regions can be made into high road regions. Why would you care about metro regions? And here don't think about terrible big cities, oh, I'm a country boy, I'm a small town boy, I'm a country girl, I'm a small, whatever. Don't think about New York or Paris or anything that seems threatening like that. Or think about it and go to it. Remember what Mark Twain said, well, when I left town and to go to St. Louis, my mother said, if you go to St. Louis, the women are fast, there's a lot of political argument and conversation, and they gamble at night. And I went, and she was right. And I resolved never to leave St. Louis again. There is that. There is that. Cities are basically marriage markets. I hope a lot of you want to get the heck out of here and get to a big city and do something. But even if you don't worry about it. Don't think about cities as this terrible place, this cauldron of evil. Think of them actually as the solutions to most of your problems. Why? Because they're big, they're strategically located, they're linked to one another, they're powerful. Those are the top 10 metros in the U.S. That's how they compare to other world economies. Get those organized and you're on your way. Get all 100 organized and you're fine. They got population and firm density and agglomeration effects, what economists call agglomeration effects. In effect, increasing returns you get for any dollar invested as a result of the density and interaction of firms and people, which enables different sorts of effectively joint production among them and cross-firm learning and whatever. It's a little bit controversial, but not too. People think that you do get those increasing returns. And certainly we know empirically cities are much more productive than elsewhere. They got buying power, they got infrastructure, they got higher wages and productivity. They're more easily organized because they're dense. They're also lower waste. And for those of you who don't care about the economy but care a lot about that end of the Anthropocene thing, really a lot about climate, think of cities as your friend. If America was organized as a city, it would be much better. New York City has more population than all but 39 states and uses 1/3 less energy than any one of them. It's really energy efficient. Here's Chicago, less efficient than New York. On the one side, you have tons of CO2 per square mile. Chicago looks like Chicago's here, okay? It's a great city on a great lake, okay? You with me? You all see this? You look puzzled, ma'am. You all right? No, you're right there, ma'am. Oh, okay, fine. And that's per person. It all looks blue and cool and cold. That's what cities are. If you want to attack somebody on climate, attack the suburbs. Attack the soccer moms. Attack anybody driving back and forth. They're the ones who are wasting things in inefficient ways. And cities are also appealing for other reasons. They're centers for research, education, healthcare, a lot of stuff that you identify with the new economy. Knowledge, finance, business services, hospitality, a bunch of stuff that may or may not be that interesting, but it's certainly big in cities. They got the eds and meds. They've got they're the beneficiaries of a bunch of demographic changes. As people get older, they're going to want to be near some of those services, and then they're also more diverse. Freie Luft is what the Germans used to call the cities. You can breathe free air. If you were a gay kid in the 1950s, you sure didn't want to live in small town America. You wanted to get the hell out of there and get into a city, and maybe hide even there. If you're a single woman, if you're a gay woman, anyway, if you want to anyway depart from some sort of norm. If you're African American, if you're anything, anything that has diversity, and with diversity risk of strangeness and threat from others, you're attracted to cities. And the same reason they're attracted to youth, and again, there's sort of marriage markets for youth and immigrants. Anyway, so here's the basic line. You can rebuild your metropolitan areas, you increase their productivity, you reduce their waste, you capture locally the benefits of doing both through democratic organization. They're organizable, but to do that, you need the infrastructure. It's just not going to happen. You got to do it. You need to have organization. It's really as simple as that. You say, okay, well, how can I start? Well, you can start anywhere, basically. You get agreements, these are the capacities needed. What's wrong with this list? And then you say, okay, so how do you measure organizational performance in this town or wherever you're organizing? How are we doing on these 7 or 8 capacities? And then if people say, okay, I don't want to build capacities because if I help you, then even though this is going to help us as a people, as a democratic people, as a movement to build democracy, it's going to make me a little bit less famous or reduce my budget, even though it's going to, relative to yours, not even in absolute terms. That's the sick people stealing each other's medicine. I think you've got to establish a culture in which you say, if really all you're about is building your organization and not a democratic society, then goodbye. I'll see you later when you grow up. You got to be able to say goodbye. Then do a map of what you have. Regularly review progress. There's some stuff on governance. Again, it's not actually rocket science. It's already been done in some places, but with less transparency and completeness than desirable. So again, what's a progressive strategy? How to get here? How plausible is that? Equal opportunity, equal protection, democracy. Start this way. Pave the high road now. Momentum. If you have some success, people are attracted to success and power. People don't like whiners. People don't like defeat. People won't be attracted to you if you are defeated all the time unless you got a pretty compelling story. You got to get that story and you got to get some victories. It's not like people walk away from you if you're ever defeated. Goodness sakes, how can you look at the civil rights movement in America and think that people were always winning all the time? You got to have some justice stuff. You have to have the idea of building a society fit to live in. It's not about money. Democracy is not a calculation. It's a choice. It's a choice. It's got to come down finally to matters of the heart and morality. You can't get away from that. But also don't be stupid and don't have people say, oh, yeah, I can't live on morality and decency. I got to have a job. You got to take care of the materiality. And your basic message is pretty simple. Look, if we ever got our stuff together, we'd be a lot smarter and certainly stronger together than we are alone. Nobody in this room knows how to do all this stuff. Everybody in this room together, if they cooperated, could do a lot. The question is, how can we get that cooperation? And if we got that cooperation, then that would get us back to that old cemetery. It'd be, there's an idea. But it's very possible now, to forget just how unbelievably radical that idea was, that democracy idea. Just the stuff that Lincoln was talking about, just that. Nothing fancy. So radical. And look at where we are now relative to those ideals. That's that's the remaining task before us. So, let me ask you, I want to wind up here, but let me ask, is Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, David Richmond, Ezel Blair in the room? Or Mohammed Bouazi? You know these names? Okay, the first 4 are kids your age, black, from North Carolina State, who started the civil rights movement through sit-downs. Just your age, less educated than you are. And Mohammed Bouazizi is the street vendor in Tunisia who ignited this, apparently, who the heck knows where it's going to go, unbelievably promising democratic revolution in the Middle East. 1 people, 4 kids, older guy. Don't tell me it's not possible for people to do things. What's always surprising among people attracted to that ideal, that democracy thing, is how surprised they are that other people are also attracted to it. They say, it's always this moment of doubt. And coming against you, in that moment of doubt that you'll have, there'll be a bunch of people saying, you can't do that. It's impossible. There's no alternative to the way things are. Give it to the banks. There are people smarter than you. You're a fool. You're small. Or I'll bribe you. Or whatever. First they laugh at you, then they fight you. Then they what? Then they fight you and then you win. Gandhi's thing. Don't believe that there's no alternative. There's always alternatives. And having started with Lincoln, let's end with Levi Strauss. We'll just read this. But I'm done now. Fine. At 8:05. Not too bad, but not too great either on timing. Okay, so that's what you should do. That's where he came from. That's why you should be of good heart. Don't be discouraged, and that's all I have to say.